it's pretty challenging to get an interview right now through the applicant tracking systems. I had one hiring manager tell me that for a PM role, they got 19,000 submissions. And it's just impossible for a human to go and sort through all of those. And so everybody's using filtering mechanisms to try to tease out the things that they most want to see from candidates. And usually that has to do with specific words and phrases that are in the job description. And there's been a little bit of a counterbalance to this in the AI job writing tools. So you get resumes that look exactly like job descriptions, but don't actually say anything meaningful. It is possible to get interviews through a cold application, but what I recommend if you're going to go through that path is to try to also get in touch with either the hiring manager or somebody who's on a team that you might be working with in the role, and let them know that you applied and let them know a little bit about your background and how you might be a good fit for it. But beyond that, I think the most useful thing that you can do is get referrals or get introduced to the hiring team. That's really the way to be top of mind.
This is a wild market for product managers. The hiring landscape has shifted more in the last year than it has in the previous decades. With hundreds of thousands of people actively looking for the next role, we thought it would be helpful to invite a couple of folks from the Supra community to have a chat about how to navigate this job market. And for those who are not familiar with Supra, Supra is an invite-only community for ambitious elite product leaders. In this episode, Ben and I were joined by Gaurav Hardikar, who is a VP of product at HomeLight, who on the side also mentors PMs who are either changing roles or actively interviewing. We were also joined by Andrew Chapello, who is a FinTech product leader who was recently in the job market for the first time in 8 years. And he was super intentional about the way he went about his search, which eventually allowed him to land a fantastic role and a hot and up and coming startup in the FinTech space.
Yeah, this conversation was really interesting and I enjoyed it a lot. We covered a ton of ground, including how the PM market's changed in the last 6 to 12 months, how to set yourself up for success as a candidate in this market, tips on getting interviews, why cold applications and cover letters are probably going to be a huge waste of your time. We have some advice for running due diligence on companies when you get to that all desired offer stage, and we covered a lot more ground. If you're in the market for your next product role or even thinking about going in the market for your next product role, we think you'll find this conversation really relevant and actionable. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy it. Hey, everyone. We're live. So I've been looking forward to this conversation. I think that we're all talking about the job market lately in different capacities. Some of us more actively than others. Some are hiring managers. Some people are interviewing. I think that the world has changed a lot in the last year or so. And I think we thought there would be a lot of value in having a conversation, piecing together what we're seeing in the current job market for PMs and product leaders. So I'm really excited to dive in. So Gaurav, maybe we'll just start with you. The first thing we want to cover here is just get some thoughts on how do you think that the PM job market has changed in the last 6 to 12 months or so for PMs as ICs and both as product leaders?
Yeah, Ben, it's a great question. If you recall over the last 5 to 10 years, I feel like PM started as a very nascent role and expanded a lot where PM teams were growing to 20, 30 people, even startup stage, right? And at this point, it's the opposite. As tech has shrunk and as AI and everything has come in there, the market's shrunk, products gotten a lot of scrutiny to think about like what outcomes are you really driving? What's the purpose of this role? And what are like why do you need every time you need a new PM, you need to justify what is the KPI or the business goal that they're going to own, which has not always been the case. So I think going into a little bit more depth there, while PMICs, their job roles are pretty active, competition's increased tenfold because of that. There's not that much room for APMs or even non-PMs trying to transition in. They really have to fight for the role. And I think everyone just wants experienced PMs more than anything, where they're going to be, oh, here's a 5-year PM role is what's demanded. The last thing I'll say here that's been specifically the last 6 months is COVID leveling is being discounted. So I think at this point, it's like, oh, okay, I get that you were a director, senior director over there before, but I don't think that applies anymore because now the entire bar has been lifted.
So what you're saying, Gaurav, is that someone who maybe in the last couple of years made that leap from something like group PM to director is maybe finding themselves back interviewing for or finding out they're only really eligible or qualified for a GPM role versus staying in the director path.
Exactly.
Got it. Super interesting. Andrew, I'd love to get your thoughts on, is there anything you want to add to that you're seeing from recently exploring the market?
I think Gaurav is largely right that the justification for hiring a PM has gotten higher over time, especially as companies have pared down their R&D budgets and had to justify each incremental head. Another thing that I've observed is a desire for very strategic PMs that cover a large surface area within a product. So where you might have had a 1-to-1 PM team ratio in the last few years, now it's becoming 2, 3, or even 4 teams to 1 in a lot of companies. And that theme of leverage is something that is proliferating.
Yeah, I think another interesting thing that I've observed too is that coming out of the zero interest rate period, a lot of orgs had scaled really quickly, and you had people that were ICs that got promoted into managers very quickly, had teams under them. And what that meant is that then in the last maybe 5-6 years, you had a lot of people that got promoted to managers. And now with the correction, a lot of those orgs have become flatter. And what we're seeing is that there's just not that many jobs for manager out there. So you have people that used to be managers that now are realizing, hey, I'm not confident that I can find another manager role. So now I'm also going to go for those senior IC roles.
Yeah, I talked a little bit about how the role of the PM has changed, but if you go all the way back, it's like the product was created at Microsoft, right? Originally being oh, we need someone to help guide what engineers do. And then each stage of the tech industry, the PM role has changed, right? It first was oh, what's a PM? What's a project manager? What's a program manager? Then it was, okay, now we have digital product. Let's now expand on this. And then that's when we had PM roles grow and specialize into everything. And now we're contracting again to being as Andrew said, we have less PMs, but they own more teams, but probably own only one business goal, right? So I think that's the change that I'm seeing.
Cool. And I'm excited to go deep later in the podcast on what are the steps that you can take to land an interview or prepare for the interviews. But something that I've noticed from people that have been very successful in this market is that they are very intentional about the way they prepare for the interviews and the things they do before even they start the entire process. So can you both talk about what do you recommend people doing before they start that interview process? And I'll start with you, Gaurav.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. When you're first starting out with the interview process, it's all about mapping it back to what your goal is. You've seen this on many different channels of let's think about your own career as a product. So that's very true. But I also think about your entire career as a narrative. It's what's your narrative? What's your story? Our product managers' best skill should be how they describe and describe a narrative about whatever they're building. So same thing should apply to your career. If you can't justify why you went from one role to the next and what you find meaning in, it's really hard to do that. So I would say step one, think about what you want to do in 5 years, right? It doesn't have to necessarily be a role. It could be oh, I really like what Ben's doing. I really want to make sure I do something like that, right? Even that's better than nothing at all. And then map it back. But that, as you start doing that, year by year, you're going to say, well, I'm in this role. Here's what I want to accomplish. And when you get to that next part, then you say, okay, here's what I'm going to, do that, to achieve that. So then interview prep and, sourcing roles or applying roles is wholly about that. Is when you maybe it becomes actually fun to explore with different, employers or different, people in the roles being hey, what's this role mean? What are you going to do in the role? What's the daily responsibilities? And then you gut check, is this fitting what I'm going to do, 3 to 4 years from now? So that's what I'd start off with.
Yeah, I totally agree that setting your goal is the first thing to do. I call that, what's your career objective? Where do you want to be in 5 to 10 years, as you say? And then what are the pieces that are missing in that narrative, or what do you need that narrative about your career to be able to say in your next role? The other thing that I'd add is thinking about the different aspects of your work that you want to optimize for in this. So like hybrid versus remote is an interesting topic right now. What's the ideal setup for you? What's the ideal industry that you want to be working in if you have any sort of focus? What part of a product would you want to work on? Are you thinking more about the developer experience? Are you thinking about a front end? Are you thinking about infrastructure? Thinking about the different aspects of where you want to be in this next role.
Yeah, that's all really, really stuff I agree with. I think the one thing I would add, just playing off of what Gaurav said, is I think at its best, a job search can really feel like fun dating. It can feel like really getting to know people in ideally a more organic way that feels like you're looking for chemistry. You're looking to see if there's a real fit from a personality and philosophy perspective. And sometimes it's actually hard to anticipate what that fit is going to feel like on paper before you start the search. So sometimes the best way to actually start the search is just to start the search and start having conversations and learn and tweak as you go. So let's get tactical. Is there anything that you guys would recommend to someone who's thinking about getting started other than reaching out to companies, applying to roles? Is there any like pre-work that is maybe a little past what we just talked about, which is more at the level of the narrative and the goals and the philosophy, but is there anything tactical that you would recommend people do first? Yeah.
Totally. I think after you've created that narrative, something I'd recommend is putting together a list of target companies or like target areas that you want to try to pursue. So maybe if you've got a specific industry, there's 4 or 5 companies that are really interesting to you. And then try to find if you have connections, either first or second degree connections who work at those companies, and just ask them about it. See what their experience is like and whether or not they would recommend it, and just start with that as an information gathering of, is this really the direction that I want to go in? And if you feel passionate about it, perhaps you could ask for an introduction to the hiring team or for a referral. That's really the best path in. But I think doing a little bit of diligence and networking on your network's experiences at these companies can pay dividends.
Maybe a quick follow-up there, Andrew. When you're making that list of target companies, are you only making target list of companies that are hiring for PMs, or do you do it regardless of whether they have job openings or not?
Yeah, I think a job posting is like a static artifact in time, and like eventually most tech companies will be hiring PMs. So it's hard to know when you see someone that explicitly has a rec open where they are with that. They could have someone that they're about to close. They could be right at the beginning of their process and just gathering feedback. So I would recommend doing it regardless of whether you see any open roles.
Gaurav, anything you want to add on this?
Yeah. So I think, I'm gonna double down on the entire narrative piece here. I think that, similar to how, we talked about it, it being like dating, you gotta be sure to understand what you're presenting yourself as, right? And let's be clear, most people don't know what they present themselves as. So I think the first step I would do is, yes, the resume is like it's like your first impression, if you're just like your digital impression, right? But
It's your
if
Hinge
someone was to
profile,
ask you,
basically.
yeah, exactly. But like, if someone was to ask you, like, "Hey, walk me through your resume," you better be able to walk through that in like a concise 90-second pitch, right? Just similar to what you used to learn in school about like, oh, like give me your elevator pitch. You got to do that for yourself, right? So I think the first step is get your resume in order in terms of what outcomes you drive. Number 2, record yourself on like a loom and just do a 2-minute recording and walk through your resume. And I bet you, even before you send it to anyone else to give feedback, I will bet you did not realize you sounded like that. And you're going to end up fixing it. And you're going to do that again and again until it makes sense. And you want to get to the point where when you go speak to your friend about, hey, this is what you're doing, because you're going to probably tell people I'm looking for a new role. At that point, they better understand what you're doing. Because if you go in talking about some technical terms that's not understood by anyone, then no one else is going to understand you either. So
Yeah, I fully agree. I'm doing a little bit of interview coaching on the side right now, and I recently helped someone get their story together. And they were struggling. They've been at the current company for 5 years, and they worked in probably 3 different areas in the company, kind of 3 different parts of almost like the user journey, from acquisition to activation to retention. But their progression within the company was not linear. So they started in activation, worked backwards to acquisition, and then ended up moving to retention. They're having a very hard time of telling that story in a chronological way. So I think learning how to get comfortable with that forward progression through your last 5 to 10 years, I think, can just require that practice. And sometimes just a sounding board that tells you, hey, like, that was a little confusing for me. Maybe there's a way that you can make it feel a little bit more fluid, could be beneficial for someone who's never met you before to feel like they can follow your progression.
Yeah, I have one more point on that after you said that, Ben. It's, when you go through your past 5 to 10 years, you're talking about what you did, but you need to be a little bit visionary in terms of selling what you're going to do, right? And if you don't do that, you also come off as, not very interesting. Also ties back to dating.
I think it's a really good point, because the thing I work on with people after we get their story right is also, what do you want to do next? And that's the part that is probably really important to tailor to who you're talking to. Because if you're like, I really want to work on, like, I want to work in a publicly traded company, and you're talking to someone that's like at the Series B, I mean, obviously you're tone deaf to who you're talking to. And I've been surprised at how hard this can be for some people to come up with like that personalized blurb. But the way I generally recommend people approach this is, there's the things you're looking for at the company level, and you want to tailor that to why this is the right company for you. There's things you're looking for at the team level. And I think I would talk to the people that you've, LinkedIn researched, or the people that you've met so far in the process, and what it is about them that really appeals to you. And then there's the job itself and what you're looking for in the day-to-day work. And you could share some assumptions about what you think is true about the job, and then open up the space for them to tell you, do you think I'm missing anything? Or do you think that my understanding of these 3 elements is actually calibrated to the reality of the situation? And that kind of starts an interesting dialogue with a company that shows that you've done your research and you're being very intentional. And if you're wrong about something, it also gives you the exit ramp in case you've actually made a terrible assumption about what the job is you're actually interviewing for, or a team or something like that.
Awesome. So now we have all the tips to get all the ducks in a row before jumping into the interview process. Now, what I'm excited to talk about is, I hear from everyone that the application process is broken. You can apply to a lot of places. You rarely hear back from anyone. So I'm curious, from your perspective, how are people landing interviews these days? Andrew, you can go first.
Yeah, sure. I think that it's pretty challenging to get an interview right now through the applicant tracking systems. I had one hiring manager tell me that for a PM role, they got 19,000 submissions. And it's just impossible for a human to go and sort through all of those. And so everybody's using filtering mechanisms to try to tease out the things that they most want to see from candidates. And usually that has to do with specific words and phrases that are in the job description. And there's been a little bit of a counterbalance to this in the AI job writing tools. So you get resumes that look exactly like job descriptions, but don't actually say anything meaningful. And so all that is to say that it is possible to get interviews through a cold application, but what I recommend if you're going to go through that path is to try to also get in touch with either the hiring manager or somebody who's on a team that you might be working with in the role, and let them know that you applied, and let them know a little bit about your background and how you might be a good fit for it. I've found that sometimes helps to accelerate you through the process. But beyond that, I think the most useful thing that you can do is get referrals or get introduced to the hiring team. That's really the way to be top of mind.
And maybe a quick tangent on those AI writing tools. Are they helpful? Do they actually add value? Are they a distraction? I'm super curious. I've heard of Teal. I've heard of Oda. So any insight there from either you, Gaurav, or Andrew?
Yeah, my take is that it's okay to use them as a way to get inspiration, but if you use them as a way to describe your entire personality and your narrative, I think that's a bad idea. At the end of the day, at least for a product manager, you're trying to represent yourself and sell yourself as a specific quality or whatever you're trying to do there. So I do not recommend using them to do everything for you. But maybe one day we'll be there, but not today.
Yeah, to be more specific with my question, do they help get to those filtering mechanisms to land an interview, or not really?
I guess this relates back to, I guess I'll answer the initial question too as part of this. I don't think applications mean anything at this point. So I personally agree. I agree with Andrew that it's all referral and intros, which in that case, an AI resume would not do anything for you. And I think that's especially relevant right now because the PM market is oversaturated. And because of that, you have to compete through getting direct connections.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is my observation of those tools is what they do is they generally make your resume look more like the application. And without heavy editing from your part, it can be a bit of a word salad that is not really useful to anybody. It might get you past an ATS system, but if a human looks at it past that, they're going to know that you used one of these tools.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And when it, just like tactically speaking, if you want to get referrals, the things that are really important is to be prepared to send a blurb to the people that you know at those companies. So I would really prepare a handful of blurbs for different types of companies where you might want to get referrals. And a blurb will include your LinkedIn, it'll include what you've been up to, it'll include what you're interested in next, and they'll be tailored to that specific kind of company. And then I would use LinkedIn for any companies that you want to apply to see who you know who works at those companies, or who you know who maybe is connected to someone at one of those companies, and just really exhaust your network. And in the chance that you don't know someone at those companies, only then would I try some kind of cold outreach. But I think cold outbound to someone at the company is probably still a higher quality shot to take than cold applying to the job itself and hoping to hear back.
Yeah, I agree.
So, okay, so we talked about some stuff that is helpful to do. What do you guys think, maybe starting with Gaurav this time, what are some of the things that people like waste time on when they're starting to apply to jobs?
I think, so similar, I'm going to take an opposite approach to what I said a little earlier. I think while you should spend time on your resume to get it right, I do not think spending 2 weeks on your resume is worth it at all, right? So you need to definitely control the amount of time you spend on these documents. And cover letters, I don't think really matter at all anymore. Like you said, Ben, the blurb is probably like your new cover letter. It's like, here's what I'm about. And then you send it out and it's like a short snippet because people don't have a high attention span. You got to make sure people are able to read it fast. Yeah, I think focus on the highest outcome things here, which are reach outs. Don't focus time on getting the perfect documents.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that investing all your time in either your resume and making that quote unquote perfect is worth it. And cover letters, I've never seen one of those work. And personally, as a hiring manager, I've never looked at one. The only thing that I'd add is a lot of job boards now get pretty stale in terms of their listings. So trying to find one that's constantly updated is a great tool here. I don't have a great recommendation. There's 30 or 40 of them. But trying to find one where the postings are 45 days old, they've already filled that role or they're not going to. And that's not worth your time.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of wasting of time, we've mentioned that in general, cold outbound to people in the company is a waste of time. But I'm curious to dig a little bit deeper on what about cold outbound to hiring managers? I've heard people that had mixed success with that. Is that an exception that you would say to the rule of cold outbound or not really?
I think it can be. In a recent search that I did, I got a response maybe 20 or 25% of the time on those, which I think is pretty good. So going in with the expectation that most people are not going to respond, I think is important, but especially if you have some unique skill that you can offer, I've found that hiring managers are often willing to bump you up the queue.
I was just going to say, I think the other meta waste of time that I see people do in interview processes is they just waste time talking to companies they don't want to join.
Yeah.
And I don't know why. Maybe they want to get the offer so they could leverage it in negotiating for the job that they actually do want to join, or maybe they view it as a type of practice. But I've seen people spend tons of time on jobs where when it comes down to it, they actually are not that excited about that company. And I would just caution against wasting that time and energy.
So it's funny is I think I agree with you that when you know it's not the right fit, you have to exit for sure. But I do think at the beginning of your job search, it's important to get reps in. If you don't do that, you may not even recognize that it's not the right fit. So it's like a balance between that. And then Marc, to your earlier question about the cold outbound, I think the one alternative is you may not have a first degree connection on LinkedIn, but you might have a second and third. and you should use that, right? The real thing is get an intro, and then it's not really cold. So even if you find a path of getting there, that is worth the extra effort.
I just want to bring up one more thing about interviewing with companies that you don't necessarily want to join. I think it can be useful to get reps in, but I've seen a bunch of people get rejected by companies that they didn't want to work for, and it still stings. Maybe not quite as much as if it was your dream job, but it can discourage you from moving forward. So just a word of caution to be a little choosy after you've gotten your first few reps in.
Yeah, rejections always suck.
Yeah.
When I've run searches, I feel like energy management is a really big thing for me, and because interviews are draining, and if you're going to spend your time interviewing for a company that you're not that excited about, whether you get rejected or get the offer at the end, you're still taking that energy away from opportunities you are excited about, and then you're not your best self in those other interviews. So good to be cautious. Let's talk a little bit maybe about due diligencing companies. Let's say things go well. You've gotten the introduction, your resume is dope, you have the right blurb that got you in the door, you get to the on-site, you go through everything, you have an offer at the end. How do you guys think about the best kind of diligence or the most effective kind of diligence to do on companies when evaluating these kind of offers?
I think if you're looking at venture-backed companies, if you can find a way to talk to their investors and get a sense for how they feel the business is doing, I think that can be really useful. They're all going to talk their own book and try to encourage smart people to join their portfolio companies, but you might be able to glean insights that you wouldn't get out of people who work there. The other thing that I don't think a lot of people do that I think is really useful is talking to former employees of that company. And maybe they left for different kinds of reasons, but trying to get a sense for what the culture was like. I found that these kinds of people tend to be a little more candid about the environment and about the prospects for the company. And maybe that discourages you, maybe it doesn't, but at least you go in eyes wide open.
And Andrew, maybe a follow-up there on talking to former employees. What is your tactic to finding them? Do you look for someone in particular? And what does the outreach look like when you're trying to talk to them?
Yeah, it's a great question. Typically, it's people who had a similar kind of role. So I'll look around on LinkedIn and, try to do the same, either cold or warm outreach. Typically, I'll also ask for a small amount of time, whether that's 10 or 15 minutes, and try to make it really easy for them to have that conversation and be really pointed about it. My meta observation is that people have an innate desire to help others, and being willing to ask for that. I found 50 to 75% hit rate on even cold outreach for former employers.
Yeah, I think my perspective on this is when you're doing due diligence, you need to think about what level you're looking at. So, for example, if you're earlier on in your product career, you will probably index more for skill development than anything else. And so that will determine how long you decide to stay and then if it matches your goal. So you need to think about, okay, well, does this company support skill development effectively? Am I learning the right things? Are the people that surround me people I want to learn from, right? That's probably more important earlier in your career. When you're a manager, you probably want to think more about, let's say you want to stay there 2-3 years. What would it take for that to actually be true? And then at that point, I totally agree with Andrew's points about investors, former employees, all that kind of stuff. You need to do due diligence on and really understand how their funding works. How is the startup, especially if it's VC backed, how is it being funded? And the last point is general sentiment of culture, I think is pretty important, especially if you're considering remote versus hybrid versus on-site. I do think you can gain a lot still from looking at Glassdoor. Obviously, you need to be able to, and I think as a PM, you should be able to do this anyways, is sift through a bunch of random comments and figure out which ones are real and not. So I think it's important to be able to look through that and be like, okay, this is the general sentiment of the company by team. And then that can be used when you have those conversations with former employees or even current ones, right? Those actually should build better questions for you.
Yeah. Where my head goes when we talk about due diligence is I think there's kind of a right sizing of the due diligence and direction of the due diligence based on the maturity of the company. So early stage due diligence is very different than due diligence when joining Facebook, for example. And so I just want to plug, if someone wants to hear more about how Marc and I think about due diligence at the very early stages, we did episode 1 of the podcast talking about evaluating Series A and seed stage companies joining as their first PM. So we went deep on that there, but I don't have too much to add to what we talked about here. And then when we think about the process from starting a search to landing a search in Q1 2024, what are you guys seeing as the general timeline people are looking at for PMs?
I would say probably if it's an effective search, about 2 to 3 months. And that means that you've done some of the suggestions that Andrew and I have already said, right? Meaning the first week and a half is like, okay, I'm getting my resume narrative right. I'm trying to get in some reps in terms of interviews that I can get naturally. And then it's all about applications. Get 30 a week out in terms of intros or just like outreach, right? You want to just start doing that. And the first month, like after that, you're basically in the first rounds with recruiters. You start getting into the mid rounds with every interview cycle. And you really want to, by the end of month 2, you're in final rounds and offers, and then it's just negotiation. So I think that's that's the phases I would think about. Maybe, Mander, you just went through a cycle yourself, so you might have something as well there.
Yeah, I think 3 months is reasonable for a beginning expectation, but I just caution that I know many people who had stretched to 6 or 9 months, and then you start to get into seasonality. It's very hard to get a job in Q4 as people are wrapping up their budgets for the year, whereas it's a little easier right now as everyone has kicked off their 2024 budgets. So I agree in that kind of phasing that Gaurav laid out. I'd also suggest trying to track your process like a B2B company would track sales, where you have a funnel and you say, here are all my opportunities that I'm considering. I am in outreach to these. I am at a hiring manager screen. I am at a hiring manager interview. I'm at the panel interview. I'm doing a problem. Being able to track that funnel really helped me to be able to allocate my day appropriately, spending more time for those that were later in the funnel, but also making sure that as I looked at a week, I was doing more on sort of the top of the funnel work. The only other observation that I make is I've seen more and more companies introducing more stages in the process, whether that's a panel interview, whether that is a take-home assignment, or it's a specific case interview that has to do with your work. So where the average company might have had 3 or 4 rounds for a PM, now I've observed it's closer to 5 or 6.
Yeah, 2 to 3 months to me sounds very nice. I've definitely talked to a lot of people where they're closer to 6 to 9 months. Maybe that's more of a factor of the seniority of the role. I buy that if you're in a senior PM or junior PM, 2 to 3 months makes sense. I'm curious what you've seen in terms of the timeline move, depending on how higher up you go into the chain. And then the second one that I'm super curious to get the group's thought on is, how does the timeline change depending on whether you're doing this full time or you also have another job that you're doing?
Yeah, let me break it down in terms of how I think this works. So basically, if I'm looking for a role, let's take one scenario where I'm looking for a role. I'm not currently in my job, but I could be at any level. I think the main difference is, do I have my story correct? Because if I don't, the reason I think it'll go to 6 to 9 months is I'll basically burn my first 3 months. I'll think I'm ready. I think that everything's going to go well. And then the first 3 months, sometimes I just burn a lot of my opportunities. And then I have to restart, I have to reset, and then I kind of keep going. So I think there's a lot of what I've seen, and I know everyone on this call probably advises people through their career and through hiring decisions, is I've seen a lot of people come in with expectations of comp, expectations of what the role is that are COVID level. And that is no longer how the world works. So I think that's probably the first shock that a lot of people get when they re-enter the job market. And I think that's why you've seen a lot of 6 to 9 month things happen. I think to your question about, am I in the job right now or am I not? The way that you pursue the interview cycle and then the opportunities is very different. If you're not in a job market, you're going to spend 40 hours a week or more just looking and sourcing and splitting time, similar to what Andrew said in terms of the tracker and the funnel, right? But if I'm not in the job market actively, I'm casually searching, I'm just going to be saying, hey, if I get something inbound, maybe have something very interesting that pops up. I mean, for example, the way I even entered HomeLight was like that. I was casually searching. I was not actively in the market looking like that. And that actually is more common as you're more senior.
All right. Thanks, guys. So I'm excited about this next part because I think this might be one of the first ones that you guys disagree on, and I think we could have an interesting debate. So the topic is essentially whether in this current market it's better to be a generalist or to be a specialist. And Gaurav, maybe you could kick us off this time. What's your take?
Look, I think with the market changing in terms of technology stack as much as it is, I would probably advise towards being a more of a generalist to show that you can drive outcomes no matter what the technology is. That being said, and I'm sure this is probably where Andrew's going to go, is I do see value in specialization if that's like your end all be all. I just know that for myself, I tend to get bored of things quite fast. So I think that being a generalist for me and people like me is a good option as well.
Yeah, I totally agree that as far as the type of technology or the type of skill, you want to be good at being able to talk to customers, being able to formulate product strategy. That's true no matter what role you're in. But I think that there's a lot of value right now in specializing, especially in terms of industry and being able to be a subject matter expert. And the reason I say that is I've been through a lot of processes and advise folks who are interviewing, and they get to the end of the interview process and what they hear is, we really liked you, but somebody else had solved this problem before. Or we really liked you, but somebody else had more domain expertise. And they don't get any critical feedback other than somebody was more specialized in terms of their role. The other way that helps you is it helps you focus on companies a little more. It helps you identify that target list a little easier of companies that are related to one another. So I found that to be a helpful guide. But Gaurav, I also get bored of things. So bouncing around within industries can be helpful.
One other thing to add on to that is we think about specialization a lot of times in terms of like tech stack or things like that, but it's really either a tech specialization or like an industry specialization. While I consider myself a very generalist consumer product person, I have chosen prop tech as something I tend to specialize in. That being said, who knows? I'm sure in 5 years I'll be like, oh, I want to try something different. I went into smart home for a bit too. It's very different based on what you think.
Yeah, one thing I'll just add before we move on is for better or worse, I've probably leaned more on the generalist side of this in my career and have viewed each experience as earning a new badge in an area that I don't have a lot of experience in. So stages, I've been across a lot of different stages, B2B, consumer, marketplaces. I've gotten exposure to a lot of these. And I think if you're viewing your career as less of a linear progression towards a specific goal, but more of a learning journey that you're on to just experience and get exposed to as many things as possible, it might be okay to actually miss out on some of those specialist opportunities in favor of that personal learning.
Yeah, I think this also relates your story and your narrative. You can always find ways in which you had a previous experience that made you a domain expert in your field. For example, I went from Asana, which was a work management collaboration software, to a clinical trials company. And I had zero expertise on the clinical trials space, but I had a lot of experience creating software that allowed people to work together, which is part of the problem that company wanted to solve. There's a lot of different ways describing yourself as an expert, even though if it's not domain specific or industry specific or technology specific. And I think that goes back to spending a good amount of time on the narrative and preparing for the interview. But awesome. We talked about how there's just not that many people management roles out there. There's not many group PM, director, or VP roles, which means that a lot of those people managers are now forced to go into IC roles. So I'm curious if you guys have any tips for those managers that are now applying for those IC roles.
Yeah, well, this directly applies to me in my recent search. I think the key is being able to show that you have an understanding. It's okay to talk about times where you were managing a team, but talking about how you help them perhaps to achieve alignment or to overcome some obstacle can help to demonstrate that competency. I think that the line between a group PM and a lead or principal has gotten pretty blurry. And those high-level ICs are still expected to help their fellow product people in a similar way to management, but without those direct management responsibilities. So being able to show that you can do that is the key.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, Andrew. I think that the manager role in general, especially in the last 6 to 12 months, has become where you have IC work anyways. It's not a full management role at all. So I think that regardless of whether you're a full official IC or not, even as a people manager, you're going to be required to do more IC work than you thought. And then given that, it means that as a manager or IC, you need to be very good at building product and being able to coach people in both types. So it's really just a preference on what you want to be held accountable for is really the main thing you have to think about.
Yeah. One thing I'll add here, which is maybe just a little counter to the main narrative in the PM world, is I really don't get why so many people are trying to not be ICs. The people that I know in product management got into it because we like the IC work, and then there's usually some kind of pressure to move up the ladder and get promoted and get more responsibility and scope. But at the end of the day, a lot of companies are realizing that they can compensate people in a really attractive and meaningful way as a very senior IC. So your compensation is probably no longer a main reason to not want to be an IC. And I also think that the day-to-day work just allows you to actually just enjoy the job more. You have to deal with less politics, less bureaucracy as a people manager. And I think if you've been a GPM or a people manager for the last few years and you feel like you maybe have to go into an IC role for what's next, I would just question the premise that's not a good thing and embrace that could be a really good opportunity to re-engage with the joy of the work itself that got you into it in the first place.
I totally agree with you, Ben. I think that, yeah, IC work is often, sometimes you look forward to it, right? And even you're a manager, like, oh yeah, I get to do this project by myself with the team, and it's really enjoyable. I also think the PM role already is a lot of indirect management by default. So I don't think you have to look at it like that at all. I think what I find is interesting is full people management, product management never made sense, actually. To your point, it always should be partial IC work. Otherwise, you lose your edge. You lose your value to the team. You're not able to advise the same way.
Yeah, and I see a path that's become well-worn in engineering starting to happen in product, of managers going back to IC work and then perhaps going back to being managers and having this sort of fluid transition between them. And I think that's a good thing. I think that will lead to a more professional set of PMs and managers.
One thing that it's a really interesting point you're bringing up, Andrew. I'm seeing a trend in engineering that I'm sure you guys have seen where there's this tech lead role that's been getting formalized where engineers can step into something between engineering manager and IC engineer. And I haven't quite seen that play out in the PM side. Have you guys seen this kind of role start to get formulated?
I think to some degree, like the principal role is becoming that, but it's not, doesn't necessarily have very direct people management. It just has more scope of control, and it's becoming more common as we were talking.
Awesome. This has been an incredible discussion. It's going to be very timely for the broader PM community. I know there's a lot of people out there looking for their next role. So thank you so much, Andrew and Gaurav, for joining Ben and I. It's been a lot of fun, and I'm excited to get feedback from the rest of the community. Thank you all. That's a wrap.
Thanks, guys. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with someone who you think would benefit from it as well. We really appreciate it. We'd also love a follow or a rating on Substack, Spotify, or YouTube. That's going to let other people find us. And if you have any topic recommendations for a future episode, please send myself or Marc a DM on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks.